Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Andrew, it is a pleasure to have you back on the show. Would you mind reintroducing yourself to everyone out there listening?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Robbie. My name is Andrew Iler. I'm a lawyer in Ontario, Canada. I practice mainly in corporate, commercial, and administrative law. Um, and I've had an interest in the JFK case for decades. And in the last 5 or 6 years, I've taken that interest and really developed it specifically in the area of the JFK Records Act and the handling and mishandling of the JFK records over the last since 2017 when all the records were supposed to be released. I've done substantial research and drafting, particularly in respect to the lawsuit that was filed in California. I'm not part of that effort anymore. But I've kept track and I've written extensively on the JFK Records Act and the recent postponements since 2017 of these records.
I don't know what your personal life is like, but when it comes to the JFK assassination, I have to ask, did you have any friends reach out to you like, hey, did you see that these files were going to be released? Because I didn't realize how much I talked about it in my personal life until the Trump signed the thing, and then everyone sending me messages. Did you see this? Did you see this? I'm like, do you not think I hadn't seen it? Come on now.
Yeah, dozens and dozens of text messages, calls. A lot of people were going, "Oh, you must be so excited! The files are released." I got to say, I think it was a positive move, but really, the files haven't been released. Nothing has changed. And I mean, we're still waiting, as I know you want to talk about. We're still waiting to see what this new plan is to release the 3,500 or so still secret records and redactions.
Now, what was the actual terms for the declassification? There was set to order a law, or he was going to sign something to where a plan could be established, and he was supposed to have the plan. And we're past the date now, and there still has been no plan when we're recording this on February 10th that has been released on how these documents are going to be declassified. Because once that gets declassified, then I think 45 days later, we get MLK, and we also get the RFK assassination ones, which I'm more hopeful for. But to me, and I think a lot of other researchers that aren't really looking for that smoking gun, I think this was more of a show. So far, it seems like that's holding true with the fact that we still don't have anything. So when you saw these Trump sign this thing to release these files, what went through your mind? And then did you look into what was actually going to be happening with the files and declassification?
Yeah, so on January 23rd, President Trump issued an executive order. And the second part of the order required the Director of National Intelligence and the Department of Justice to come back to him in 15 days with a plan to release all the records. Now, I got to say, that was kind of bothersome because in 1992, Congress unanimously passed the John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act. And that act was the real plan to release the records. I mean, they struck the Assassination Records Review Board, which existed between 1994 and 1998, and their only job was to obtain review and create disposition orders for every single record and redaction within each record. And the ARRB did that. So there's no more detailed a plan possible or in existence that would be better than the ARRB's plan that they took 4 years to execute with a staff of dozens and dozens of people and a budget, I think, of between $4 or $6 million a year to get and review and issue orders on each of those records. So, when 2017 came and the first postponement of the full release of the records happened under President Trump, it really sparked a fairly significant backlash in the research community. Clearly, issues with compliance with the act were in full view. A lawsuit ensued to force the records once President Biden came into power. President Biden issued a number of executive memoranda with regard to the disposition and the planning for the release of the records, which again, it was contrary to the law that was passed in 1992. But so what we've had are multiple lesser plans under lower standards to withhold these records since October 2017, right up to the last new plan under President Biden, which essentially punted the decision making with regard to these records right back to the originating agencies like the CIA, the FBI, for them to control the release of the records. And that's exactly what Congress tried to take away from these executive agencies control over the assassination records and the release of the records, because clearly the agencies don't want to release the records.
Speaking from a legal standpoint, do you think that it's because nobody wants to deal with the ramifications that comes after releasing those files, or do you think it's just lazy government file keeping and like nobody just wants to go sift through it and trying to redact or do whatever they have to make sure whatever stays classified is still classified? You hear the more conspiratorial points all the time about JFK files. Nobody wants to see what I've seen. You wouldn't release it either. That type of mentality, which I do believe there's probably some things like that, but we're 60 years a little bit more past. I don't see what would be necessarily so sensitive. I think now at this point, it's much like how so many people or agencies have thousands and thousands of documents stacked up to the roof. It's just lazy, slow government, and they don't want to just go through all this type of stuff. It's the last thing on their mind.
Yeah, I mean, I got to say, I don't think it's laziness, because these agencies have fought tooth and nail to stop these records from being released for 60 years. And Robbie, you've interviewed some of the most serious and significant researchers and decision makers in this whole JFK story. And your research has probably shown you over the years, information has trickled out, whether it's the Zapruder film or the Northwoods operation documentation, whether it's various connections and surveillance that Oswald had with the various agencies. All of this information has slowly trickled out. I mean, the biggest one, and I don't know whether you've had Doug Horn on, but it's certainly his real area of focus, is what happened between Parkland Hospital and Bethesda, because the public was told from the very beginning that the Parkland doctors had no idea what was going on with the president's head wounds, and that the Parkland doctors got it all wrong, even though, two very experienced senior neurosurgeons described a large hole in the back of the head of the president with cerebellum coming out of that hole. The public was told, no, the autopsy doctors at Bethesda had everything right. And for decades and decades, until the ARRB deposed these Bethesda witnesses, a bunch of them, and deposed the Parkland doctors and revealed that even the Bethesda medical staff statements back from the 60s, they suppressed the fact that a large number of the Bethesda staff saw the same thing that the Parkland doctors did, a hole in the very back of the president's head. And all of that information was suppressed. And so, is it laziness? I don't think anyone in government really wants this information to come out. So, what has President Trump done? I think personally, President Trump probably wants to be the president to release all of this information. But when you think about it, what benefit does it do for President Trump to release it, other than, satisfying his desire to be the president that released it all? Keeping it secret potentially gives the president leverage over the agencies that want to keep this stuff secret. So I wouldn't be surprised, Robbie, if these JFK files are now some kind of bargaining chip or negotiating factor between President Trump and the agencies. So I'm not going to be surprised over the next few weeks or months that maybe a few small insignificant redactions are released, and there's a big media coverage saying, oh, the files are released. But really, it's probably going to be an insignificant number of insignificant files, and then a large number of the um, more onerous files containing more serious information are probably still going to be withheld. That's what I'm anticipating. I think these files are now a power bargaining chip between President Trump and the agencies.
Do you think that's because it reflects how bad the government agencies did their job, or, well, I guess depending on who you're asking and what your belief is on the JFK assassination, but even with the Secret Service, federal judge John Thunheim literally said that the Secret Service destroying documentation 2 weeks after he requested that certain documentation was a problem and an issue, but it could be chalked up to the fact that they were negligent in their duties. Whether it was drinking, whether it was whatever, they wanted to cover something up to not reflect how bad the agency did as a whole. Same thing with these agencies. Could it be possible that this being used as a potential bargaining chip could be a factor of how incompetent these agencies were, whether they didn't want to do an investigation? I'll tell you, here's my little theory. It's not, all I'm saying is, listening to Malcolm Kilduff's oral histories and a lot of people that are their oral histories that were involved in the government at the time, I started realizing people have a very heavy drinking problem, whether it was the Secret Service or whether it was just high up government officials. I think even Malcolm Kilduff is quoted in his oral history interviews of just as how we do open politics. When he was traveling all the time, he went to a deep dive of how much alcohol he consumed and how it was just a normal thing for so many members up there. Where I go, how many of you guys were conducting an investigation that didn't want to do it because it would be more paperwork and you'd rather just go home and drink a beer or do something of that sort to let the edge off? I mean, I hate to say it like that because it sounds like a stupid example, but if you know how much they're drinking at the time, how bad the Secret Service was drinking for Abraham Bolden's accounts and even some of the accounts of the own Secret Service members, that infects your brain and that gets you to a point where you don't really want to do your job. You're ready just counting the minutes to clock out and go home and have a beer, or have a beer when you can sneak one. So I start wondering, and I'm not saying that's the giant excuse for the grand conspiracy. No, I'm just saying when it comes to these agencies not doing their duties right. I mean, we know William Harvey is a name that gets a suspect in the assassination. He had a heavy drinking problem when he was supposed to be doing like training anti-Castro Cubans and all this type of stuff. So I'm curious when it comes to all this infecting into the agencies, it's going to look very, very bad either way. And I'm wondering if this is a giant cover up to deflect on some of these problems and inefficiencies during the investigation that is very embarrassing to the agencies as a whole, that would really demolish the reputation that we have of them. I mean, we think of the Secret Service as these armed protectors that will protect the president's life over anything. But you really examine it, some guys are like in their mid 20s, early 30s, and they're protecting the president when they were just at a club at 4 a.m., getting drunk and leaving firefighters with the president. So, you know what I'm saying? Like, I'm trying not to find a rationale to it, but I'm trying to understand why, because I do tend to believe the Assassination Records Review Board members from the ones I've spoke to. But I'm curious, what do you think as the whole bargaining chip, the deflection on the agency's reputation? And then also, how has your perspective on the Assassination Records Review Board changed since we talked around 6 or 7 months ago? I mean, you've heard them on my show. I've spoken to them. I know what they've told me, but from your research and things that you found in the National Archives that's new, what has your perspective changed on them as a whole?
Yeah, I think when you really look at all of the incidents of questionable behavior, and questionable investigations, and conduct of senior people in respect to the JFK assassination, um, you can accept the random kind of incompetence that would possibly go into allowing this kind of atrocity to happen, both atrocities, the atrocity of the assassination itself, and then the atrocity that ended up being the investigations, whether it's the Warren Commission or the House Select Committee on Assassinations. But at some point, when the pile gets so enormous of acts of incompetence, you really need to wonder if there's another better explanation. And I think,
Missing presidential breakfast and then missing the president's brain. Two different levels there.
yeah, I think it's becoming harder or maybe even impossible to explain the serial incompetence that's happened over the last few years. Now, to answer your later question about the ARRB, the fact that we got the JFK Assassination Records Collection Act passed, even to begin with, is a bit of a miracle. I mean, we can all thank Oliver Stone, whether you love or hate his movie. It got that act on the table at Congress. It was passed unanimously, and it really did put into effect a really serious process. And they call it an accountable, enforceable, independent process to review and release all of the records with regard to the assassination. They had a very short period of time. They had a colossal amount of documentation and records and evidence to review. And in 4 short years, they hammered through millions and millions of pages of documents, films, photographs, and thank God they deposed under oath a bunch of witnesses that really cleared up a very hazy part of the medical evidence. Did the ARRB do a perfect job? Did they get every record possible? No, they didn't. They didn't have time. They didn't have the budget. They didn't have the staff. But what they accomplished was miraculous in the short period of time. They did an exceedingly diligent job, and I got to hand it to all of the members of the ARRB and their staff. They were professionals, and without their work, I think we would still be deep in the weeds on so many issues. So I think we should all be thankful for the work that they did. When I was at National Archives last November, I was there with one specific mission. And through reading the legislation, it became quite apparent that the ARRB had a mandate from Congress that when they reviewed each record, they had to issue an agency final order that finally disposed of how that record was going to be handled. Was it going to be fully released or opened in full, as they say, or was it going to be postponed from release? And then if it was going to be postponed from release, were they going to order a date for periodic review or a date that the document was going to be released in the future? And the Act specifically provides that they have to issue a written report for each record. And it's in a little bit of an obscured part of the Act. And it doesn't state things in the kind of language that we now have. But what the ARRB absolutely did is they created what is called the Assassination Records Review Board Final Determination Notification. And they did issue tens of thousands of these final determinations for each record and each redaction within each record. So there's a decision on each, even one word. If one word is redacted, they issued a decision, a written decision, saying how that single word being redacted is supposed to be dealt with in the future by the archivist, whether it was going to be periodically reviewed in a future date or released on a future date. And really, over the years, I've seen just a scattering of a few of these Assassination Record Review Board final determinations pop up. It seems that when the archives digitize certain records, once in a while, they would include one of these final determination notifications, but they are not available at archives in any digitized collection, and they're not properly cataloged or indexed so that you can actually search for them. You can't find them. And in October last year, I made a specific request to NARA that I have access to all of the ARRB final notifications, because really, since no one has seen them, there is no way to seek judicial review or to try to enforce these final orders by the ARRB over the years. Because what I did find when I got to archives, they produced about 450 of maybe 37,000 available final determinations. So I only got a small sample of them, 450. And I made copies of all of them, and I've created a database, and I've cross-referenced them with the current status of all of the records that they apply to. And what I found is hundreds of the sample that I found actually ordered the records or redactions fully disclosed to the public back in January of 2006. And a large majority remained withheld right through 2018 to 2023. And there are still some, I believe, 4 records that I found that were ordered released in January of 2006 that are still being withheld under President Biden and the CIA's transparency plans. This is huge news, Robbie. Everyone in the research community is wondering why the records weren't periodically reviewed in accordance with the Act and why a lot of these records remained withheld. Well, these final determination forms fully explain what happened. And the fact that you can't search them on NARA's website, there isn't a catalog of digital copies. All of these records should have been digitized and publicly disclosed and prominently posted on NARA's website so that both the archivist and the American public could seek to enforce those orders after the archivist was supposed to release these documents. And the fact that they weren't published, they weren't digitized for the public, they weren't accessible, there was no one there to seek judicial review over each of the decisions, to basically force the archivist to do their job. And that's what happened to tens of thousands of these records leading up to 2017. These decisions were essentially buried in the stacks at archives and totally ignored for about 15 years beyond when they were ordered released.
Now, being made aware that, or the National Archives being made aware that those should have been released, will that refresh? Like I said, we got to kind of understand the line here between incompetence and just neglect when it comes to the JFK files. I think that's pretty important, just so people can stop rolling their eyes at the whole subject in general. But obviously, for a lot of us, we wonder why these files weren't released. But we're also on top of it, probably more than the average government official that would be in the archives, or someone that would be working there would have probably the opportunity to look at. I think for a lot of us researchers, that's our main priority. For a lot of them, it seems like it's kind of like a backlit thing.
Yeah. When the ARRB ceased operations in 1998, in the fall of 1998, they transferred all of their records to the National Archive. So all of the ARRB's internal records went there, including all of these final determinations. Now, the ARRB's job when they first formed in 1994 was so huge, and the amount of documentation that they were processing was just, it was unfathomable. Millions and millions of pages of records. And they had these standards under Section 6 of the JFK Records Act that they had to apply. And they had to make decisions. And some of these documents were 200, 300 pages long. And they were required to release as much information immediately as they possibly could, but postpone smaller parts of some documentations. So, like a 260-page CIA document on Mexico City would have 200 redactions or 250 redactions. And for each of those separate redactions, there had to be a specific order. So what the ARRB did is that they were almost forced to create a proprietary software, and they ended up calling it Fast Track, and that allowed them to track each of the redactions and postponements, so that they could diarize them for future review, and release in accordance with the Act. And what the ARRB did when they went out of operations, they sent that software and everything else over to NARA. All National Archives really needed to do was continue that software operating, because the diary popped it up in a very systematic way when periodic review was required or when the document was supposed to be released. Um, so there's no excuse why the archives didn't follow the orders. And I've got an article coming. Sorry, I got an article coming out, hopefully in the next couple of days, that's really going to detail this information and what happened to stop the records from coming out.
Can you possibly explain what happened besides just the whole thing we just kind of explained? But do you think it's like when it comes to nefarious? You obviously have spoken with many researchers who have different experiences with the National Archives. Few of them say that they appreciate the National Archives, but many of them talk about looking for files and applying to get a box of files, and they open it up to say it's been redacted or it's been reclassified due to some type of circumstances that happen. Now, we know about reclassification does happen in certain instances when it comes to the JFK files, where I start wondering, could they just release a bunch of files, and would it have to take a researcher or someone who knows the RIF numbers like Joseph Bax to be able to understand that they've already released these files in the past? Because I've seen, I think, a couple releases that happened either a year ago or 2 years ago, and a lot of it was just the same stuff that was already on the site on 2023. So I'm wondering, besides them waving the flag of, hey, yeah, we're releasing files, but there's not really anything new, just stuff that was reclassified and they redistributed it back out. What have you come across that has shown them kind of neglecting or doing something more on the aspect of keeping those files still locked down? I mean, again, the researchers that go there to the National Archives and have these experiences, I do believe them. I do believe that there's something going on that they don't want released at all, and they're hoping people just forget about them. But sadly, for a lot of members of the research community, it's kind of their whole life. I think it's been honestly and captured for all of us recently. But now the American public is wanting to know what's going on, and so we're getting a little bit of
Yeah,
steam.
you know what? Listen, you're asking questions that I've been asking over the last 6 months about all of this, and I've sought out who I consider the most expert researchers on the assassination, people who are familiar with the archives. Um, and I pretty strongly believe that no one has seen the volume of these final determination notifications. A lot of the top researchers just weren't aware of the implications of these final determination notifications, and quite frankly didn't believe that they were produced in such a huge volume for every single record and contained the information that they now are shown to absolutely contain. So the fact that like top NARA researchers, people who've spent days at the archives, are somewhat shocked that these final agency orders exist, tells you that how well they were, I don't want to say hidden, but how well they were kept quiet at National Archives.
Obfuscated.
And that,
Use that word. It's more of a professional term for collusion, in my opinion.
yeah, I have to say my experience at National Archives was excellent. I mean, these are professionals. They're experienced people in handling the files. They protect and hold some of the most important documents in American history. So they have a pretty serious responsibility to take care of all of these records. Um, but there's that, and then there's really following the law that mandates how these records are to be publicly disclosed. And the fact that it took me, a Canadian, and 60 years on after the assassination and 30 years subsequent to the passage of the act and 25 years subsequent to the winding up of the ARRB to track down hundreds and hundreds of these final agency orders disposing of the records and redactions. How is that possible that no one else has come across this? I I just don't, I can't explain it, again, just by sheer bad luck that these files, found their way into the dark depths of the National Archives. Look, I don't want to cast aspersions or speculate on who or why or what. I've just tried to really stick to the facts, and to be able to go on to the catalog, and search something. That I found a box and a half of these final determination notifications at NARA. I asked for all of them. I got a box and a half. It totaled, like I said, about 450 records. And Robbie, like, for whatever reason, the box that these records were contained in was labeled press and public contacts. Had nothing to do with the fact that they contain the most important legal documents produced by the ARRB. The box was labeled and cataloged press and public contacts. I took a picture of the box. I'll send you a picture if you want to throw it up. It should be a little bit surprising. I've written directly about this in the article that's going to be forthcoming. But this is what I think is pretty breaking news. And the implications are this: if the ARRB issued final orders to release these documents, they issued the orders in the 1990s during the operation of the ARRB, and the release dates, and it says release date, January 2006. Under Section 91 of the Act, the agencies had only 30 days after the ARRB issued these final orders to appeal the decision to the president. And the records show that while the agencies may have tried to appeal some of the early ARRB decisions to President Clinton, that President Clinton advised them that he wasn't going to be mediating arguments between the agencies over redactions and records, like hundreds or thousands of appeals. He told them to go and figure it out themselves, the agencies and the ARRB, and which the ARRB did. And right after all of those early appeals, the ARRB seems to have changed their policy, and they started issuing a lot of release orders instead of just periodic review orders, or postponing until 2017. They released a ton of orders to release these records in the mid 2000s, and by all appearances, it does not look like any of those orders were appealed to the president as is required by the act. So those orders stood. They still stand in a lot of ways. So the question is, what do we do about that? If they issued orders, the orders weren't appealed, and those orders stand, um, I think really what arises from that is, was President Trump in 2017 advised that these orders existed? And I mean, if you look through the memo created by the Office of Legal Counsel, dated October 26, 2017, it's pretty clear that the president wasn't advised in that memoranda that that these orders existed releasing records. What that memoranda states is that, oh, the ARRB issued some orders, and they require, or they've postponed the release of these records until 2017. But that wasn't the full story. So I think it's very, very possible that President Trump and President Biden were not made aware that these orders existed. They weren't made aware that the ARRB issued disposition orders for each record, and that a lot of these disposition orders required the documents be released in the mid 2000s. And I think if either President Trump or President Biden knew that, they may have made different decisions in terms of their omnibus postponement of thousands and thousands of records.
I'm going to play
And that's a
devil's
problem.
advocate. I'm going to play devil's advocate here. Do you think they just weren't made aware of the final decisions of the ARRB, or do you think, because they have to be aware that there were files still sealed? I mean, this has been one of the biggest controversies that trends every anniversary event for the JFK and the RFK assassination, unless they're not turning on the TV. I don't see that there could be a complete neglect, or they would have known, hey, don't we have files somewhere that we could possibly, what's going on with that? But if it comes up to a slip of the chain of command, are they prioritizing other things? I mean, obviously, we've been through a lot of events in the past 8 years. Just overall with wars and other things that's been going on. Gaza's been trending.
Just let me clarify. Okay, we're talking about two different things here. The thing that I'm saying that the two presidents were not made aware of were the existence of these ARRB final determination notifications that made decisions, that issued final agency orders with respect to each of the records. Now, both President Trump and President Biden are clearly aware that there are assassination records, like that have RIF numbers and that attach to the actual evidence of the assassination. These ARRB final determination orders are a different thing. And I just have a strong feeling, based on all of the correspondence between the archivist, the Office of Legal Counsel, to Presidents Trump and Biden, that they weren't advised that these final determination notifications disposed of many of these documents and released many of these documents like 20 years ago. I just don't think they were made aware of that.
Again, though, but wouldn't they have some type of knowledge that there was files or some type of notices? Maybe not the ARRB's final determination notices, but that there were files still being sealed. It just seemed like the whole topic in general was neglected. The whole area of the JFK assassination files.
100%. They knew that there were withheld records, but if they knew that there already were orders to release these records, that's what I'm saying they're not aware of. There's two different things. There's the records, and there's the ARRB orders to release the records.
I'm aware
right?
of that, but like I said, if they don't have an interest in even the remaining files, why would they care so much about the Assassination Records Review Board's final determination orders? If it has to do, it seems like the whole subject in general of JFK just seems to be neglected and not to be in the peripheral of the president's vision.
Well, I think they were kept in the dark about these ARRB orders, right, that dictated the release. If they weren't told about them, look, the research community, who's been intimately focused with everything to do with the assassination and the records, the research community itself wasn't aware that these final determination notifications existed. So there's no possible way that President Trump or President Biden would be aware of these documents.
I guess
Um,
where the misconnect here is the fact that, do you consider the Assassination Records Review Board to be an actual thing that was going to end up having what its purpose was completed? Because so many people are very critical of the Assassination Records Review Board as just being a time filler. Like they're eventually we should have records right now. Everything should have been declassified when the ARB ended, before the ARB ended, but it's clearly not. We're many years past when the ARB was done, and we still have a lot of files sealed up. A lot of people think of them like the HSCA, like a show. Now, in the first few years, and I've spoken to John and I've spoken to Tom Samoluk, they talked about they had a lot of government backing and a lot of public backing when it came to their first few years, and then it just faded off because people got bored with it and got tired of waiting and waiting for releases, and they ran out of money and they had to stop. That's a lot of people consider the Assassination Records Review Board as just not what it was intended to do. Not in honesty, it wasn't. It didn't do what it was supposed to do. It did a lot, but that's where I'm saying is I don't think there's not an interest in that whole thing.
I'm smiling because your impression of the ARRB and whether it was successful in executing its mandate actually boils down to these final determination forms, right? And if they were made public and the archivist complied with his Section 5G1 ministerial duty to conduct periodic review and 5G2 duty to downgrade and declassify these records, all in compliance and consistent with these ARRB orders, you wouldn't have the feeling that you do that the ARRB didn't do their job, right? Because these orders are the pinnacle of the ARRB's work. Like the most important documents that the ARRB created were these final determination notifications. And if the archivists complied with their duties and publicized all 37,000 of these final determination notifications and complied with the ARRB's orders within those, all of those, not all of them, but a good majority of the records would have been released before 2017. Okay. So it wasn't the ARRB's fault. And I'm not trying to brush aside, maybe some other problems that the ARRB experienced in like fully collecting all of the records. That's something totally different, right? But the ARRB really did do its job. They issued these orders saying that these records should have been released. Once they went out of operation, there was nothing that the ARRB could have done in order to they had no legal authority to force or enforce their decisions. Really, it fell down to the House and Senate oversight committees to ensure that the archivist was doing their job, and it really fell onto the president to ensure that his executive agency, the National Archives, was doing its job. But the ARRB did its job, really. And the proof is in these final determination notifications.
Again,
Because
I'd be more critical towards the ARB, not the actual individual members, because I think they went above and beyond what was expected of them in the first place. I think Jeremy Gunn's the best example because he had interviewed a lot of people in ways that I think Tom Samoluk and others didn't know they could be doing. I thought a lot of it was going to be research, like accepting letters from research people, seeing what they could investigate, what could be released and what couldn't be. But they were pulling out some insane witness experiences and what people that either took a sketch of the brain or took a photograph of the brain and had it confiscated by a Secret Service agent. That was very important to the historical record of where some of these things and missing pieces went. But again, their final determination notices being sent, was that going to be ethically right in their mind? They thought it was going to be done, but really it got lost in the chain of command because those weren't expected to go to the president at all. It was a show. That's my whole point here. When you look at the ARB and what these members believed, I believed all of them were honest and genuine. But I think when it came to what their final, this is what's going to be released, this one needs to be released, I see that getting lost in the mail. You know what I'm saying here? I'm not trying to sound super conspiratorial, but at the same time, it just didn't seem like it was ever going to be anything more than what they were already doing when it came to just the things that I just mentioned a minute ago. I don't think it was going to seriously be the open of all the records. I don't think that was ever going to be the initial intent. For them, they didn't know that. But it's much like the HSCA and Blakey. How much information was kept from Blakey of the HSCA that the CIA didn't want released? How much did he accept not to release or investigate into because the CIA said so? Maybe they just told all these members, hey, release these files or submit your determinations before the ARRB ends. And then when it ends, they send all these things in there and someone else handles it from there. I mean, again, that sounds a little bit more conspiratorial, but at this point now, I just don't see how you could lose something like that. I mean, a giant agency that's been running for a couple of years ends and you decide, I don't know, just gets lost or this was neglected to.
No, you know what?
Precedent.
It didn't get lost because they are all of these decisions and orders are at NARA. They are at NARA, 100%.
So who's not doing their job? Who's not doing it?
Yeah, it's the archivist who had the duties. And I agree with you. Okay. All of these orders should have been put front and center. Okay. They should have been published. They should have been complied with, and they should have been monitored and diarized, so that the archivist could follow up and release all these records. That, by all appearances, has not been done. There wasn't adequate periodic review, and certainly in the records that I've come across after my visit to NARA, there are hundreds of records where there were release orders that weren't complied with. That's on the National Archivist, and that's on National Archives for essentially, I don't know what they did with these final determination notifications. I don't know what they did. I mean, they're impossible to get your hands on.
What's the step forward? What can we do? As just, I mean, does that require a lawsuit for each individual final decision made by the Assassination Records Review Board, or to start declassifying or making these things prioritized and signed off on to be released, or does this come into a petition or something that we have to do as the? I mean, I don't see another Oliver Stone JFK Impact movie coming anytime soon to be able to get some real government headway here. So I think a lot of people now are just curious to what can be their step forward.
Yeah, so when I was down in Washington, and just before I went to the archives in College Park, I had the opportunity to meet with Congressman Tim Burchett from Tennessee, and Congressman Burchett has taken a huge interest in the JFK records, and along with two other congressmen, he has written President Trump and made a lot of excellent points about what should happen, what President Trump should do. So what I've recommended is a two-prong approach to this. Number one, President Trump needs to be made aware that these final determinations disposed of a lot of these records back in the mid-2000s. And President Trump should immediately release or order the archivist to publish and release all of the Assassination Record Review Board final determinations, so we can see what the lay of the land is in terms of real plans to dispose of the release of these records. The second thing that should probably happen is that Congress has not conducted any oversight over the JFK Records Act. Congress should haul the archivist or acting archivist now before the oversight committee that has oversight over the records and find out what the hell happened with these final determinations. Congress can order the archivist to release these records as well because they have oversight over the JFK Records Act. This should happen immediately. And really, all of the records that were already released by the ARRB, they should be immediately released. And what would happen, Robbie, is that would significantly lessen the number of records that are justifiably continuing to be postponed. The act required that only the ARRB, the House, the Senate, and the President have control over records. The agencies don't. And sadly, President Biden has put the power right back into the agency's hands. And I would be surprised if President Trump allowed that to continue um, after being misled about these ARRB final determination notifications. It's a big story here.
Is there something that like Robert Kennedy or someone would have power to influence at least being made aware of this situation? It's hard to believe that, RFK doesn't have some type of knowledge onto this, but it sounds like it's pretty surprisingly new information. I mean, there's
Yeah.
a bit of a story already related to these, not just the JFK files, but I had a guy, Matt Alford, if you've ever heard of his name before, but he did a documentary with Oliver Stone and called Theaters of War about the government's influence into movies. And a lot of these files that should have been released about defense DoD contracts signing up into influencing movies and really sprouting out propaganda in movies like Transformers, Battleship, and so many others, they were just locked into some guy's private collections. And it was just neglected there, but the government kept storing the files there because nobody was requesting in that certain area for those files to be released. It should have been made aware to the public. It seems like a lot of the stuff when we deal with the National Archives issue, not just when it comes to neglect, but it seems like they find a loophole every single time to where they're not necessarily lying to you when they say they don't have a certain file, but it's not in that record collection. It's usually ending up somewhere else. I mean, we have many JFK files that are covered in things like JM Wave and things that people might have an interest in, but it has nothing to relate to the actual assassination, just government operations that are happening overseas at the time. So I'm wondering how much of this could be secret government wordplay or just fun lawyer speak to, that's a whole Warren Commission. If you read the report, it's all just lawyer speak. It's literally just finding loopholes and finding different wordage and things to make it sound like they're doing work, but they're necessarily not really doing work. They're not even really investigating things.
Yeah, it's the fact that I really stumbled upon these records, even though I was looking specifically for them, things do get buried. And whether being buried is a matter of just the volume of files or there's some other explanation that they didn't want certain files to surface. I do have a hard time believing that records of such substantial impact and ramifications as these ARRB final determination notifications weren't immediately published and made available to the public and diarized by the archivist and then made virtually unsearchable in the catalog. It's a difficult thing to explain away. And there are, like you say, hundreds of other kinds of records that probably just haven't seen the light of day yet. And that's why the research community is pretty amazing. You have a bunch of diligent people just digging and digging and digging and finding these records. And this is new. And you ask whether this should be something that Robert Kennedy Jr. is made aware of. Yeah, I certainly hope that he pays attention to this discovery and the unearthing of these documents, because I think the whole Kennedy family should be a little bit surprised that that this was not dealt with when it was supposed to be dealt with, and we're still, 30 years after the ARRB, we're still struggling to understand what the hell happened with the release of these records.
Are you hopeful?
Yeah, I think, whoever places their hopes in the hands of politicians, they're just going to be repeatedly disappointed, I think, because um, there are different factors at play with regard to everything, and doing the right thing is rarely a top priority, sadly. So am I hopeful? What I'm hopeful for is that Congress steps up, right? Because Congress really has no skin in the game in terms of trying to use these records as leverage against the CIA or as leverage against the other agencies. So Congress can definitely do something about this. And when my article comes out, I hope Congress and the president pay attention to the reality of these ARRB final orders, because I do think they continue to have a substantial impact.
Well, I'm not going to take up too much of your time, but where can people find your links and where your articles will be posted when they do get posted?
Yeah, we're still providing a lot of information on the JFK Assassination Chokeholds Twitter feed, which is at chokeholds or at JFK Chokeholds. And we also have a web page that posts a lot of information, and that's jfkchokeholds.com. So just to be clear, the Twitter feed or X feed is JFK Chokeholds. And we post a lot of updates on there. And I do ask your viewers to follow us, because we're going to be breaking a few new stories with new research, including this research about the ARRB final determinations. And in the coming days, there are already a lot of posts about the final determinations that have been receiving quite a bit of attention over the last month or two.
Well, I'm going to make sure I link all your links in the description for people to be able to click and check out. Thank you again, Andrew, for giving me the time to talk about the JFK assassination files and some of the final determination notices of the Assassination Records Review Board. And thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Please follow him on Twitter. You can find it in the description. Follow me if you'd like. And if you made it this far into the show, I'm happy that you did. Thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.